Mr. Darrell David.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, may I have your permission to have questions 1 to 20 taken as part of the ministerial statement to be delivered by the Minister for Culture, Community and Youth, Mr. Alvin Tan, at tomorrow's sitting, or at a sitting in August 2022, if he's still COVID positive tomorrow?
I give my consent.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Cheng Li Hui.
Question 21.
Mr. Speaker, sir, may I have your permission to take oral questions 21 and 22 by Ms. Cheng Li Hui, oral question 23 by Mr. Desmond Chu, as well as written questions 17 and 18 in today's order paper by Mr. Sean Huang and Mr. Desmond Chu, respectively, together, sir.
Please do.
The global economic environment has become increasingly challenging. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is now entering its 5th month, while economies such as China continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. Protracted global supply disruptions, due in large part to the conflict and the pandemic, have fueled inflationary pressures globally, especially through their impact on energy and food commodity prices. Now, as a small, open economy, Singapore cannot be insulated from these external developments. In particular, we have seen a significant rise in inflation. MAS core inflation picked up to 3.6% year-on-year in May, from 3.3% in April and 2.5% in the first quarter of the year. CPI all items inflation, which includes private transport and accommodation costs, rose to 5.6% year-on-year in May, from 5.4% in April and 4.6% in the first quarter. Inflation is likely to pick up further in the coming months, but should start to moderate towards the end of the year, if external inflationary pressures recede. For the year as a whole, MAS core inflation is expected to average 2.5% to 3.5%, while CPI all items inflation is projected to average 4.5% to 5.5%. Now, Mr. Desmond Chu asked whether inflation has affected consumer demand and businesses in Singapore. Notwithstanding rising inflation, economic activity in Singapore has remained resilient thus far. In the first quarter of 2022, Singapore's GDP grew by 3.7% on a year-on-year basis. Non-oil domestic exports and industrial production remained healthy in April and May, rising by 9.3% and 10% year-on-year respectively over this period. Similarly, retail and food and beverage sales volumes increased by 8.4% and 6.9% year-on-year respectively in April, reflecting a continued recovery from the pandemic. Now, for the rest of the year, the recovery in international travel and domestic demand with the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions will help to mitigate some of the weaker external demand. Ms. Cheng Li Hui and Mr. Sean Huang asked whether Singapore is likely to see a recession or stagflation within the year or the next few years. Overall, MTI expects the Singapore economy to expand by 3% to 5% in 2022, with growth likely to come in at the lower half of the forecast range. We expect growth to moderate further next year, and at this stage, we do not see or do not expect a recession or stagflation in 2023. Nonetheless, risks in the global economy remain significant. These include further escalations in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, more severe global supply side disruptions, risks to financial market stability if monetary policy tightening in advanced economies is faster than expected, and the trajectory of the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Desmond Chu also asked how rising global interest rates will affect lending and mortgage rates in Singapore. Now, to tame rising inflation, the central banks of many economies have started to raise interest rates. With higher global interest rates, Singapore's domestic interbank interest rates have also risen in tandem, although the extent of the increase have been moderated by the strengthening of the Singapore dollar. The increase in domestic interbank interest rates has in turn led to a rise in lending and mortgage rates in Singapore. And as global interest rates could increase further, businesses and households should bear in mind the rising cost of borrowing when making borrowing decisions. Now, the government understands businesses and Singaporeans' concerns. The government plans to address the challenging environment in 3 ways. First, we will maintain a stable macroeconomic environment so that businesses can make investment and operational decisions with confidence. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has tightened monetary policy 3 times since October last year. The appreciation of the Singapore dollar will help to temper imported inflation. Second, the $1.5 billion support package announced on 21st June will provide immediate and targeted relief to lower income and vulnerable Singaporeans who are disproportionately affected by higher prices. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance will be elaborating on the support measures later. Third and finally, MTI will continue to attract investments and foster new growth engines. Strong job creation and wage growth are the best ways to combat inflation. To sum up, our economy is facing significant headwinds, including a global economic slowdown and strong external inflationary pressures. However, I'm confident that by working closely with businesses and Singaporeans, we will be able to weather the storm as we did with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My question is to MOS. So since the decisive move towards living with COVID earlier this year, we have actually seen a hive of economic activities picking up, possibly due to the pent-up demand, the catch-up growth, but also the new investment activities, perhaps due to our hub status and so on. So I've been hearing businesses lamenting about the shortage of labor, this intense poaching of manpower. The turnovers are very high. We are seeing the traffics are all jamming up, with more commercial vehicles on the road. The ERP has made a comeback. The construction sector has also, back to full swing. So my questions to MOS Tan can maybe quite contrarian to the question being filed by the colleagues. Firstly, is our economy on overdrive mode at the moment, notwithstanding the backdrop of rising global interest rates at this point in time? Secondly, is this sustainable and is this healthy growth for us? Do we need to better curate this growth so as to avoid this intense poaching or pricing up of resources, and also the undesirable effect of crowding up? Thank you.
So I thank the member for his question. First, I would say that our economy is operating slightly above potential. I think the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been urging for and doing all our best to help our businesses recover. And I would also say that we should grow if we can grow, because strong growth will enable us to create jobs, good wages, make our economy more vibrant, attractive to foreign investment. It also helps us in many ways to address some of the inflationary pressures that I mentioned earlier on. But we also, granted, have to manage inflation, upskill our workers, prepare our businesses for the long run. To specific points that the member raised, if you take into account this expected recovery and also the resilient performance of some of the outward-oriented sectors, such as our electronics cluster, MTI's assessment is that GDP growth is on track to come in within the official forecast range mentioned earlier, between 3 to 5%, notwithstanding external shocks or growing headwinds in the economy. This growth forecast actually represents above-trend growth, because in the 5 years prior to the pandemic, GDP growth averaged about 3.2% per annum. This growth forecast, as I mentioned, represents above-trend growth, but along with it, also the economy's output gap, which is actual output minus potential output. And it's estimated to turn mildly positive this year. We talked a bit about labor market conditions. We all know that labor market conditions are tight. We expect it to remain tight, but a significant overheating of the labor market is unlikely. Following the significant easing of border measures since end March, the inflow of non-resident workers should help to alleviate manpower shortages and also moderate labor cost pressures in the coming months. But we've assumed that stabilization in global commodity prices and the unwinding of global supply chain constraints, both MTI and MAS expect inflation to moderate towards the end of the year, as I mentioned earlier on, even as it remains higher than the historical average. Thank you.
Associate Professor James Lim.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, MOS. I have a clarification question. In his speech, MOS mentioned that he expects the rate of inflation to moderate by the end of the year, the headline inflation to go from 4.5 to 5.5 to something on the lower end of that range. I wonder whether he would be willing to share either MTI or MAS forecasts for what it will be, not just this year, but into 2023. And related to that, whether there would be plans for addressing cost of living challenges beyond the 1.5 billion package announced a few weeks ago, were inflation to exceed what would be expected. And I ask this in part because the MES has itself suggested that as much as a third of inflation is actually domestic in origin and no longer just international. Thank you.
Thank the member for his SQ. Inflationary pressures, as we all know, are subject, of course, to external environment. And currently, the external cost pressures, I mentioned the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as supply chain global disruptions, will impact projections. But at this point, MAS and MTI expects inflation to moderate towards the end of the year, barring any significant shocks. With regards to the support for businesses as well as households, in addition to the $1.5 billion package that we announced, we have also previously announced over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, support for businesses, support for households, and in the medium to longer term, to help businesses and workers to upskill, to help businesses to prepare for the global economy, the changes, the shifts to supply chain, the shifts towards the digital economy, as well as the shifts towards the sustainable economy. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Finance will go into some of these details later in his PQ, talking about the many different fiscal measures that we have put in place to support businesses as well as Singaporeans.
Mr. Desmond Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I have two SQs. One, as inflation has stayed elevated for some time, we must expect consumers to make adjustments to consumption patterns. Can we ask the Minister of State, has inflation caused demand destruction in certain categories of consumption? And as the consumer expected short to medium-term inflation continue to stay elevated, there is a potential adverse impact on business and investment activities. Thus, the MOS or the Ministry believes that our GDP growth might therefore be affected going ahead. Thank you.
Thank the Honourable Member for his SQ. Higher prices will lead to some adjustments in consumer behaviour as consumers substitute between products as well as services. Now, thus far, the higher inflation readings in recent months have not led to any significant cutback, at least in household consumption. The latest private consumption, retail sales and F&B sales indices point to firm consumption spending. In fact, spending on food services as well as wearing apparel and footwear has seen a discernible step up relative to Q1 2022 in the month of April following the removal of mobility restrictions. I also wanted to highlight an example. There's a consumer-facing company, for example, in Singapore that has done well so far this year after restrictions have been removed is Dian Xiao E. And they shared that the dining crowd has returned and sales have recovered to pre-COVID levels. Dian Xiao E is expecting its revenue to increase by 40% from FY 2021 to FY 2023 based on its recent performances. Now on his second SQ, I would say that in the near term at least, external inflationary pressures are expected to remain strong as factors driving up global inflation such as elevated energy prices are likely to persist for some time. Now domestically, mentioned earlier that the labour market is still tight. It will remain tight in the near term, and it will lead up to continued upward pressures on labour costs. But with the relaxation of the border measures in March and inflows of non-resident workers, I think that will also help alleviate some of these pressures. DPM and Minister of Finance will also share, as I mentioned earlier, some of the different fiscal measures that will have been put in place to support businesses and households during this time. Thank you.